equator in a cipher around the planet.
Lyrical, lyrical,
As hot as the equator in a cipher around the planet.
lyrical, lyrical.
When you see me holla hello, hello I am the gifted fellow out of the crew they call lyrical opposition. I'm moving without precision, pivot in my position is pivotal with the pen. I get rid of the competition, intentional. Then again, accidental. The words impact the mental. I'm back to giving them.
There is so much happening that my brain has actively archived information for its survival. Sometimes memories sneak out of my eyes and roll down my cheeks. They tell me I just have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I am often mesmerized by abstract clusters of history and reality converging, like thoughts hopping into my mind like the cancellation of my Asian American class with another emphasis on the Chinese Exclusion Act, how our gongongs and popas taught us not to say pokai, yet here we are with decades of being pushed to the ground and harmed, if not killed. How images of young bodies of color dropping from hates coming out of hot brass shell through Ames barrels trigger voices that have told me the way they try to stop the movement is by killing off our thinkers. Quite often, my heart gets heavy and I have to ask myself, is it personal or is it institutionalized? I am haunted by the historical aura of assimilation, brainwashing, and privilege. The reality of erasure, exclusion, and visibility pulled up by bootstraps to continue laboring for an industrial institution that never really gave a damn about our humanity. While they gentrify communities, gluing together earthquake-proof glass windows, allowing us to see them, they're revealing their inability to see past the glare they think is their spotlight. My adolescence was bombarded with realizing that being in this United States meant having to sit at the table with the same people who colonized land, murdered for power, who choose to root themselves at a round table with an alternative agenda in their pocket, pitted people of color against each other, desperately hoping to make us hate one another because they hated us. I am anxiously rocking back and forth with clenched fists, waiting for my psychological warfare to dissipate. Pain demands to be felt in the most raw ways. I am a walking diary of generations of trauma seeping through my muscles, paralyzing me into the historical narrative that as an Asian woman, I am weak, silent, submissive, a fetish for white men, ill-equipped to stand vocal foreigner. Yet in that same breath, part of a group that have been deemed dangerous, because reality is, when connected with the Black, Indigenous people of color, our power would render whiteness inferior. I am here. I am able, I am ready, I am armed, metabolizing each and every emotion unpermitted to be felt by my elders, each emotion silenced through manipulated definitions of resilience. I am feeling the weight of being the only one in my family to confront oppressive intergenerational cycles. My raspy voice has been made outlier. I am exhausted, yet present. We are stronger together than we are apart. We have more in connection than the mainstream narrative will highlight. We can stand actively in solidarity like Yuri and Malcolm. They want us to fight each other while they sit back in their white-walled rooms, red and blue ties, sipping their coffee and puffing their cigars. But behold, a rude awakening when history and reality converge. They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds.
Dear ma'am, sometimes I wonder how much it took for you to be here today. I wonder, how much did you lose in the journey to achieve this American dream? How many times did you wake up with tear-stained cheeks and swollen eyes, a defeated spirit and slumped shoulders? The weight of being a single mom with no family on this land, a burden too heavy for you to bear. Dear ma'am, what stories do the calluses on your hands tell? What brilliant ideas have been long locked away in your mind because people told you your voice is not worth listening to? What painful words are still seared into your skin from the people who saw your culture as a flaw rather than your greatest gift, dear ma'am? How many times did you have to hide who you are? Sacrifice your personhood in exchange for the promise of the American dream? How many times have you had to look at yourself in the mirror and remind yourself of your worth? Pick up pieces of your broken heart and stitch them back together with hope. Dear man, was it worth it? Because to me, it seems like there is no American dream in this country that we live in. 253,000 lives lost in a pandemic at the hands of negligent politicians. Black and brown bodies murdered by people sworn to protect them. A president who enables white supremacy and fuels hate towards people who look like us. There is no dream that comes from this nation. Only a nightmare fueled by centuries of colonialism, genocide, and violence. And I cannot look at this country with the rose-colored glasses that you wore when you were my age. But I've also realized, as much as I have judged you for believing the American dream, maybe it's what you had to do to know it was all worth it in the end. That all of the tears, the times where people made you feel worthless, the nights where you worked yourself to the bone was all for something, even if it was simply to buy a house in the suburbs with a backyard patio and a white picket fence. But my American dream doesn't involve white picket fences. My dream is where there are no fences, no borders, where families separated by an unjust immigration system are reunited with their loved ones. My dream is where being Black is not a crime, where the color of one's skin is not a death sentence to die at the hands of the state, where Indigenous bodies are no longer erased from a land that was originally theirs. And I don't want a dream that is built on stolen land by the hands of stolen people, or a dream built on the backs of immigrants like you who are slaves to a capitalist system that doesn't give a damn about them. My dream is tied to the liberation of my Black, brown, Indigenous, queer, undocumented brothers and sisters. And my American dream is where you can live safely to be your authentic self, where you're not punished for speaking your native tongue, where you don't have to sacrifice every part of yourself just to survive. Dear ma'am, my American dream is not just for you to survive. It's for you to live.
I want to give Steve the last word before we get out of here.
Steve, by all means, take it away.
The last word. We are not as strong as we think we are. Stuff was happening before we even got here. That's what I hear you saying. And we need to honor that and find our role. Roll up our sleeves. You know, we know nothing until we get into the trenches with other people. Because even folks who identify with my faith, we've not done a good job of identifying what's happened before us. We just plop down, pretend nothing's happened, and we think we're going to save everyone, save our complex. Who's that about? But we have a responsibility, and that's what we've been talking about. So appreciate you guys. It's been a very honoring, uplifting time. I've had a great ride. Look forward to doing this again.
Welcome back to Reads for Resistance, Chapter 2 of Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong. And one thing that we did talk about this week that was kind of left over from last week was it was so nice to have the history of America and basically the attitude shaped towards Asian immigrants here. And for me, that was like mind blowing that America, the government, basically cut off all immigration to America from Asia and was like, no. And I think that's so funny because when we're taught in school, America's the melting pot, everyone can come. And then we look at policy and it's like, no, people that you wanted to come, people in power who felt like the other people would be able to come. I guess the better way to say that, the people in power chose who was able to come and get this American dream. And I just love growing older and learning more about the country. It's just so great. Yeah, so chapter 2 talks about stand-up. I love what she did with this chapter because she uses stand-up comedy, which I don't think I've ever read a book about stand-up comedy mentioned at all. And she uses it and talks about how Richard Pryor was a comedian, but he also was an artist and he was revolutionary. He was saying things in his jokes that was not what that was the main experience of Black people in America, but was not being talked about. And how I was thinking of it is, it's really interesting because when you go to a comedy club, you go there to listen, right? Like this person has a microphone and they're gonna speak. And most comedians who are really great at their jobs, they speak truth, right? It's relatable. And so for someone to use that as an art form and share the awfulness of racial injustices, I think that's really beautiful and dope because those audience members, those audience members and those spectators, they're coming for a show, right? But you're allowing them into your perspective, and hopefully, if they're not horrible, they're gaining empathy for your perspective, right? They're gaining a more understanding. Maybe they don't have any friends that look like you, but they like you, they paid to see you, and now they're learning more about your experience. And I think that's a beautiful beautiful way to learn. I think because when you're laughing, people are happy, right? If something's funny, you guys are all joining in on like, oh, everything's so funny, and laughter is universal. And so I think that's really smart to use something that's so happy and universal. Like everyone wants to laugh, everyone wants to have a good time, and then use it to educate, to increase empathy. Yeah, and then also I think she uses it also because she says like she's also an artist, right? She's a poet, and poetry is it's a very niche market, right? It's like you don't write novels, you write poetry, and mostly great poetry, in my opinion, is about your experiences, about what's happening in life. It's about the things that you see, just beautifully written and gives you awesome imagery. And so for her as an Asian American poet, like all of the things that she can bring to life that we haven't heard before, or that we haven't heard in those words, or even that experience, which I think is dope. And Lacey, you are a Asian American woman and you also do poetry. So I'm really interested to see your thoughts about this chapter in particular, and if your experience has been similar to hers. I think this is the chapter where she talks about how she's in these educational spaces of like, she's a great poet, she's next to other great poets, but it's still reviewed differently. And like she even talks about how a fellow, I guess, classmate, leaves a pretty wild review on one of her essays, and they eventually found out who it was, and she was like, yeah, I kind of had a feeling it was him. I was like, bro, like you were so bold to just, so it's just another reason why I feel like people get so angry with people of color because we're like advocating for ourselves, but it's like you take the smallest step to just make us feel othered. Like there was no reason for you to write a crappy review on someone's work, right?
Yeah.
And she's in the same space. You guys have the same platform, but
Yep.
you're so upset that the normative and the narrative is switching from just a white inclusivity of like you talking about flowers. Like what? I think flowers are amazing, honestly, but like it's just so very like, yeah. So did you see some things that correlated to your experience?
I would say like she talks a lot about like um like finding it being weird to be Asian American. Like
Mhm.
you're not black, you're not white. You can laugh with black people at white people and relate at a level to their racism, but then you feel uncomfortable because you know you also perpetuate anti-blackness. So she mentions that right when she's laughing at Richard Pryor, I think that's his name.
Prior, yeah.
Pryor, Richard Pryor, the comedian, and I was like, I definitely felt that. Um, and then I think also, I think being Asian American, there's just not a lot of. I think being Asian American and then being social justice oriented and wanting to talk about Asian American oppression, it's really weird, right? Because she talks about that too in this chapter. She's like, you told your whole life that Asian Americans got it together, right? You've been essentially gaslit your whole entire experience to be like, Asian Americans are the best. They're next to white. They are the most successful minorities. They drive nice cars. They don't suffer from poverty. When in your own lived experience, it's different, right? Like, if your family are refugees or if they come from a war torn country like mine are, like, you don't feel that privilege, right? And that's not to say that we don't have certain levels of privileges in like the framework of like anti-blackness, right? But white supremacy affects us to a certain degree, and it's not oppression Olympics, but it's more like this thing is happening here and this thing is affecting us just in a different dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
It's like white supremacy, we're just seeing different sides of the cube, you know, but
Yeah.
it's all on the same level. That doesn't mean it's like a ladder. I feel like as a poet, it's hard to, as a woman, Asian American woman, it's really hard to talk about that because you're like, it's hard to find your voice in that, especially because you operate within a framework where it's just like the whole world doesn't believe that your suffering exists, you know? And I really appreciate that she puts that in text, like in the book, because I just didn't really ever think about how hard it was and how it affects my artistry. You know, I'm always self questioning myself, like, should I even be talking about this? Am I the right person to talk about racial injustice? Like, do I have a footing in like political organizing? And I'm just starting to have to work through that and realize like that's a result of the model minority myth, right? Like that's a result of being gaslit by white supremacy telling me that my experiences are not real. And I really appreciate her mentioning that in in this chapter. And I appreciate her being honest with her own journey as an artist, and as a writer, and trying to find her own voice because I just think it speaks to not even like Asian American writers, but just Asian Americans in general. Like, I think we're just trying to find what that voice is for us,
Mm-hmm.
especially as a people group that doesn't have roots the way that other groups do, like just given our history, but also because like we are seen as like perpetual foreigners, you know? Like even though Asian people have been here since the 1800s, you know, building the railroad and dying to build the backbone of America in terms of like that railroad, people still see us as foreigners, right? Like when people see me, they still assume I'm from China, which first of all, I was born here. Second of all, I'm Vietnamese. So it's like,
Yeah.
yeah. So I definitely relate to a lot of stuff she was saying. And I don't know, I think it's very necessary, especially because I think if we don't learn about how white supremacy affects other ethnic groups, outside of like black-white frameworks, then we're not really going to learn how to address it in other contexts, right? If we don't learn about white supremacy in context of anti-black racism, and then like colonialism, and then like xenophobia, like we're just not going to know how to address all sides of the cube or multifacetedness of white supremacy. So
I like that cube.
yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's just like when we think about it gives us, when we think about learning about different perspectives, it gives us a better idea, right? We get a fuller picture. Same thing with white supremacy. That thing has been happening for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Black people have been like so against white supremacy for so long. It just sounds like, oh, that's just a thing they experience. It's like, nah, bro, you got some of this too. It just looks real different. The KKK wasn't after y'all, but y'all didn't get this, and y'all didn't have this, and this is what it still exists right now. And so I feel like it's always white supremacy is able to exist because people feel like they have a stake in it, I guess, right?
Yeah.
And so if we keep educating people and letting people know, like, hey, your stake ain't really there, bruh. Like, if you go bring your stake with my stake, and we all come together with our stakes over here, we can topple that. And it's more of a cohesive, and it's more of a collective, like, this is ruining everyone's life. We need to stop that. Just like with white people who acknowledge and want to tear it down, they're like, even though I, have privileges and I benefit from this, I don't like it. I'm going to go take my stake from there and put it over here. The more people we can get on board with excavating the roots of white supremacy in all of our lives, the more we can actually get to the root of it and get out. Because just like with trees, you can't just chop a tree down and be like, oh, it's gone. No,
you got the roots. Yeah. So, and then like those roots got roots. You feel me?
Yeah.
Like the roots of white supremacy.
In the Constitution of white supremacy, America is like from the inception.
Oh, yes.
Like, so we can't just be like, oh yeah, I remember that time you guys had slaves. That was really bad. And like, that was evil. It's like, nah, it's been many things. It's been many policies. It's been many powers that be that have made life not the American dream.
Yep.
Parentheses for that.
Yep.
But yeah. So again, like the first chapter, this was also a fire chapter. If you want to become a part of our book club, please hit us up on Instagram. Lacey knows the handle.
At Lyrical Assembly.
Okay. So I also know the handle. I just was making sure. You can email us at me. You can email me at Lacey at Lyrical Opposition, which would be Lacey's. Mine is Ashley at Lyrical Opposition. And yeah, thanks for joining us again. We hope to see you next week for chapter 3. Bye.
Side of the equator in a cipher around the planet.
Lyrical.
Side of the equator in a cipher around the planet.
Lyrical.
When you see me holla, hello, I am the gifted fellow out of the crew they call lyrical opposition. I'm moving without precision, pivoting my position is pivotal. With the pen I get rid of the competition. Intentional, then again, accidental, the words impact the minute.